Good afternoon. Welcome to the Royal Economic Society annual conference, which, much to our regret, is not in Belfast, it is online. But it's been a wonderful day yesterday and an equally wonderful day this morning. And for those of you joining us for this special session today, we have, to me, an incredibly interesting hour and a half ahead of us as we contemplate research funding in economics over the next few years. I have an incredibly distinguished panel with us this afternoon. I want to thank them very much for taking time to join us this afternoon. While you listen to their initial presentations, please do send some questions through the chat, and we shall try to ensure that we answer them in the second half of the discussion today. In a sense, the topic needs little introduction. The question of research funding in economics is at the forefront of our minds of the profession in academia and elsewhere. If we look at the university sector, we know very well, as a result of the COVID pandemic crisis, that finances are tight. Perhaps I shouldn't use the word hit in front of Anton, but there's a kind of question as to how the universities will ride this particular storm. In the middle of that as well, we've got to consider the demands of the USS pension as well. And when we start thinking about research, it's increasingly something that's linked to promotions. Researchers at junior level, early career researchers, are often told you can't get a promotion unless you raise some research funding. So times are getting crimped, I think, for many people working at universities. Often I find in economics departments who worked very hard, potentially as cash cows for the rest of the university in terms of their teaching, but also now being asked to raise funds in order to progress their careers. And yet at the same time, we want people to be teachers as well. And many universities use the byline of research-led teaching. In some departments, there's been a bifurcation. Some people teach, some people do research. And we've got to ask ourselves, is that an optimal way to proceed? So there's a whole host of questions at the university level. And we turn to the government, which some large degree is funding a lot of the research that's going on. The questions there are obvious. As a user of research, a hirer of the kind of people we push out of universities, as well as the agencies that are developing policy, economic policy over time. Very interested in how they're going to be thinking about research. And if we turn to the main funder of economic research in the UK, the ESRC, that's gone through some amazing upheavals in the last few years. It's now amalgamated as part of a group of 7 research institutes, as part of a larger UKRI. And you don't have to have many dealings with the ESRC, and I'm mostly complimentary about the ESRC, before you hear the leitmotif of interdisciplinary research shouted at you very often. And it's not always clear what that means to economists who are using interdisciplinary methods as a matter of course. And it seems potentially very hard for us to be fighting, in a sense, for funds against the whole of the rest of science, which doesn't necessarily understand what social science is about, and then also asking economists to make links with other bits of social science where we have to. In the middle of all of that, the very structure of research in economics seems to be changing as well. It's no longer, I've got a whiteboard behind me, but you can't see it because I've put the institute picture behind me. It's not so much a madman in front of his whiteboard anymore. It's more and more teams of people working in laboratories, men and women together, working on projects over many years. So much more amenable to a scientific or lab type structure that needs funding consistently. We've got to ask ourselves the extent to which the funders are dealing with that. And I think that's something we'll come along to later on. I need to introduce our incredibly distinguished staff panel today, who I think are well placed to discuss these questions and others in the remaining 86 minutes that we have for us. First, I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Sir Anton Muskatelli, who's the principal of the University of Glasgow, and has held so many roles in terms of important academic roles, such as being chair of the Russell Group over 2017-20, as well as a number of public policy roles, both in Scotland and also at the House of Commons and elsewhere. I'm delighted he's been able to be to release sufficient time in his diary to join us this afternoon. As well as Anton, we have Professor Paul Nightingale, who's Professor of Strategy at the University of Sussex, but is also in charge of special projects at the ESRC, someone I've got to know very well over the last 10 years or so. I'm incredibly pleased he's able to join us today and say something about the strategy of the ESRC and UKRI over the time ahead. And given the complexity of the times we live in, I feel a great debt of gratitude to Professor Agnes Benassi, who's been able to join us today. She's a school professor at the Paris School of Economics, but also the chief economist at Le Trésor, and incredibly pleased to have what I could probably call a European or French perspective on domestic funding across La Manche, but also in Europe, now that the UK has left the European Union. And that would be incredibly helpful to have some insight from you about funding domestically, but also within the European Union. I'm also joined today by Claire Lombardelli, who's the Chief Economic Advisor at the Treasury and Joint Head of the Government Economic Service. Claire has distinguished history in public policy, where she's worked throughout her career, first at the bank and then moving over to Great George Street for the latter part of her career, and becoming Director General for Economics at the Treasury recently. So Claire, thank you very much for taking time out to join us today. And last, but by no means least, we're joined by the Royal Economic Society President this year, but also Professor of Economics, Dame Carol Proper, who's going to act a little bit as sweeper at the end of the initial conversations and pick up some points that others may not have raised. So I think we're in a position to start the panel discussion. I'm going to ask the individual panelists to perhaps make a presentation of, say, some 5 to 7 minutes in their specific area. And then we will sort of dig a little bit deeper into some of the questions there, but we will consistently try to pick up questions that are thrown to us through the chat. So please, I would encourage you to do that. We'll pick them up and highlight them and try to bring those questions back to everyone in real time. So if I may, I'd like to start with Paul Nightingale. Paul, good afternoon.
Thank you very much, and it's a huge honour to be here amongst such distinguished company. I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes about the current funding situation for economics in the UK from an ESRC perspective. So we are the largest UKRI funder of social science research and economics. EPSRC claims sometimes that they fund more social science research, but Research England provides, through the dual support system, a substantial chunk of money to support research, which is distributed through the universities themselves. So I think for economists, one thing to really highlight is the demand for social science. So the government has recently published its areas of research interest. 66% of those areas of research interest are pure social science, and over 25% have an additional large social science component. So we're up into the 90% of the main questions that are urgently wanting to be answered by government are social science. And a very strong component of that is economic research. So there is a huge demand in government. We also see huge demand from industry. So in terms of the wages uplift that you get from doing an MSc and a PhD, economics is right up there at the top. As a consequence of that, and the clue is in the name for the ESRC, we are very, very strong supporters of economic research. I'm incredibly proud of the quality of the research we fund. Currently, we spend about £32 million a year on economics research. So it's the largest component of our portfolio of 19 areas. And it is the area where I have probably least worries about quality. So it's consistently very, very high quality proposals come in. It is competitive, but they are doing very well. We also fund roughly a quarter of our spend is spent on data. So other research councils have someone else to collect their data. We actually fund our data ourselves. And we are working very closely with government to improve access to data for social scientists and economists. And that's another area where we try and support economics. And also we fund PhDs and have just done a PhD review. And one of the reasons we did a PhD review is that we didn't feel that the current level of support and length of a PhD was providing what we wanted to produce the next generation of excellent economists. Some of the fantastic things we fund: CEP, LSE, IFS, our friends at the street behind Jadjit. We also fund the What Works centres, the Economics Observatory. So we've got a very, very impressive set of centres, large projects, and even small projects. So the portfolio is substantial, but it is clearly not as big as I would like. And I am conscious that people do submit proposals that get excellent comments from reviewers, and are on really important topics, and they don't get funded. I apologize for that, but funding for social science is extremely competitive. The slightest little problem will be enough to knock a project back. The impact of that work, I think, is huge. We see economists coming into our impact prize, highlighting the big impact that they do. I don't think the economics community has quite the tradition of blowing their own trumpet as other areas of academia. So I trained as a chemist, and chemists, if you ask chemists about what's the impact of chemistry, we are basically responsible for everything good in the world. Economists are trained to be more skeptical and to use data slightly more in a slightly more sophisticated way than perhaps chemists are used to. So you don't blow your own trumpet as much, and that is something you may want to reflect upon. I'm sure the panel may want to talk about that. Into the future, we are now getting more details about spending review. We're expecting there not to be a substantial uplift next year in our spend, but hopefully there'll be more money for social science into the future. One area I really, really want to get across to everyone in the audience is that while ESRC is part of UKRI, the amount of money that goes to ESRC is small. So even though the majority of, probably not the majority, but we have probably one of the largest bodies of researchers and number of disciplines we need to support, the amount of money we get is kind of 4, 5, 6% of total UKRI funding. So it's disproportionately small. There are very large amounts of money that are available for cross-cutting, interdisciplinary, collaborative funds within UKRI. So the amount of money for pure ESRC social science in economics, as I said, is about 32 million. If you're looking at these cross-cutting funds, they're measured in the billions. So there is an untapped resource out there, which I would strongly encourage economists to engage with. And I think those cross-cutting funds would benefit hugely from having higher quality economic analysis put into them. So that is something that we are would strongly encourage you to apply for. We are currently going to be undertaking a review of our investments in macroeconomics because we're very conscious that that is part of our portfolio that we need to increase. That is a review with a small r. So it's not going to be some grand named person producing some fantastic document that will be published and will be read in 100 years' time. It's quite a small scale review, but we want to get a better strategic understanding about what the demand is for research and how we can make sure we produce that. We are going to be funding more interdisciplinary work. We are funding lots of work on data skills. There are some areas of funding for UKRI which are extremely competitive. Secondary data analysis is one where I'd strongly advise economists to have a look at that. I think I'll kind of close off by saying the demand for economic research right now has never been higher in governments. The evidence from IFS on the demand for research skills in economics from industry suggests it's really, really high. I think the issue is therefore that we need to collectively, as ESRC and RES and the wider community, convince the powers that be that investing more money in economic research will generate better outcomes for society. And that is something I'm sure that we will be able to do if we can work together. Okay, that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you, Paul. Very clear. I wonder, just before I turn to Claire, I can ask you a very quick question in terms of the top brass at UKRI. Of course, you're one of the top brass at ESRC, but I wonder the extent to which the top brass at UKRI really understand or get economics. You talked about, you know, the cross-cutting funds that are available, but I wonder whether the people there really know what we're currently doing in economics. It's quite a different beast to what people might think it is, particularly those who work in different disciplines. Is there some communication that needs to be undertaken there?
I think a lot of communication needs to be undertaken there. I think public understanding and professional understanding of what economic research is very low, almost zero. There is a significant communications gap and PR gap that we are working to try and fill. And we're having to do that in a world where I have to be careful what I would say.
Don't be careful. Just say it. It's fine.
The occasional op-ed in national papers about economics, which has very little connection to reality, doesn't make my job easy.
Thank you very much, Paul. If I may now, I'd like to turn to Claire Lombardelli, who will, to some extent, give us a user perspective on this, but you're absolutely free to discuss whatever you wish, Claire. Good afternoon.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Judget, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here to discuss this topic, economics research in the UK. I mean, the Government Economic Service is a prime user. We advise across a whole range of economic policy areas, micro, macro, domestic, international. So we're a big user and consumer of economic research. I mean, applied research is essential to what we do as government economists. It informs our understanding, the policy analysis and the advice that we give, and ultimately the decisions that are taken by ministers on the basis of that advice. I mean, research from the UK and overseas has been, and it continues to be, a really vital part of that evidence base that we use and the information that we draw upon. I mean, that can take a number of forms. So it can be systematic and very specifically directed. So, for example, sometimes we would commission a piece of research or analysis directly on a subject to build our understanding of a key area. So if I think about recent examples of that we've done in the Treasury, I could point you to, for example, the economics of biodiversity, where Professor Partha Dasgupta led a team producing a report to government this year. A couple of years ago, we had a piece that was done on the international evidence base on the impact of minimum wages when the government was considering whether to take radical steps on its minimum wage policy. Aaron Dubé did a review for us there. Or another example, fairly recently, would be the Furman review that we did on digital competition and the impact of digital platforms on competition. So sometimes very specific pieces like that, which are directly commissioned, but actually government economists apply the findings from research on a day-to-day basis throughout all of their work. So this, informs all the great issues that we sort of face over the last decade. If I pick a couple of recent examples where we use a lot of research in academia and continue to do so. So when we think about analysing the impact of leaving the European Union, the government undertook quite a lot of its own modelling and analysis to estimate the impact there. And we use much of the findings from academic research, particularly around things like gravity modelling, around the relationship between trade and productivity, for example, and more recently, obviously, the COVID response would be a good example of this. We've seen a lot of brilliant innovation in the join up between academics and government policymakers here. Some real strengths, particularly around the cross-disciplinary work that's going on, and the flexibility of the academic community that has shown in bringing that research to bear. I mean, actually, while we're here, I would say the Royal Economic Society did a fantastic job in helping us join up with academics across a wide range of economic specialisms. On this, sorry, apologies. I'm in the building and we've got movement sensitive lighting here at the Treasury building. So just to say thanks to the RES, who did a great job joining us up with academics at sort of the height of the crisis, in helping us understand the latest, the best research and what it can tell us about specific issues like scarring risks in the labour market, like the impact of closing schools on education and the short and the long-term impact of that. A lot of discussion about distributional consequences. And since she's on this call, I should take the opportunity to thank Carol, particularly for her leadership on this. But many people were involved, and it's been really great, and it's shown us how this can work very quickly in real time. I mean, how the government uses research has changed pretty fundamentally over the last decade, driven by, I guess, two big trends, I would say. One is the sort of digitalization, and the other is the growth of data. So digitalization has meant really that any civil servant, not just economists, can search for and access huge amounts of research around the globe all the time. It also means that researchers can influence the policy debate much more easily and much more quickly. So, reaching new audiences, whether it's through blogs, working papers, Twitter, you might be surprised how many followers within government many of the academics listening to this will have. And closely related to that, something that we've seen within government over the last year has been the growth of data, specifically the more granular, more timely, more responsive data, and the speed with which we've had access to that, and the speed with which we've had access to the sort of research that's using that. So I guess two broad conclusions for me about the sorts of economic research that are the most useful for policy making, the sort of policy making we do in government and have the most impact. I mean, first is issues around what we can learn from and how we should understand new data and new sort of experiences. We have a lot more data than ever on things like the behaviour of consumers, firms, across different sectors, across different characteristics, and it's really a really important thing for us to understand is what is that data actually telling us, both in the UK and internationally. As I say, for example, we looked internationally, specifically we went internationally when we were looking at minimum wages to see how other countries who had different policies, what the response had been to those. But, you know, really looking at that. Similarly, if you think about COVID, we've had an awful lot of innovative policy and policy operating at a scale that we've not really considered before. And there's a real live question, which is what can we learn from that? And one thing we'd like to see in the research is more sort of learning from this kind of policy experimentation. There's going to be massive to learn, for example, from the furlough and related labour market policies, from what's happened in education, and things in the macro space. For example, the US stimulus into what will soon be a growing economy is probably one of the biggest macroeconomic experiments that we've seen in some time. So a huge amount of opportunity for new understanding and new information there. The second area where I would say research is hugely valuable in our policy making, and this links to what Paul was just saying, is the intersection between disciplines. So because policy making is by definition sort of an intersection between disciplines, and we're thinking about multiple objectives and we're thinking about multiple aspects of that, sometimes we commission research to bring disciplines specifically together. So I mentioned earlier the Furman review into digital platforms. That was an example where what we did was actually we brought together purposefully economics and computer scientists and the legal profession actually to think about those issues there. And over the last decade, you know, another good example of that we've seen very strongly in economics that everyone will be aware of is, of course, the integration of economics and behavioural science, which has led to some really, really important and really good policy outcomes. So, and again, we've seen that in COVID, where one of the biggest questions we were asking quite early on is actually what behavioural response can we expect from some of the measures taken in the interaction of kind of seeking sort of good health outcomes, but also understanding the economic impacts of that. So I guess I would conclude by saying, you know, as you might expect, research is hugely important to policy making. As Paul said, the appetite for this is great. It is increasing, and we use research as much as we can, and we use it in a much more timely way than we ever used to. And it is most relevant where it is applied, looking at real data, real experiences, whether recent or historical. And sometimes we learn an awful lot from looking back at historical experience, and in the UK and around the world, and looking at the range of data. So not just sort of averages, but also we're very interested in increasingly interested in the distribution of outcomes, and also where that research is interdisciplinary and brings together, if you like, a diversity of thinking and a diversity of approaches, which really helps with policy making. So, you know, I would just say where it brings together where it's kind of relevant in that way. If you think about the policy challenges the government is facing and government is thinking about, where research is applied and most relevant to that is, you know, the appetite for it in government is absolutely massive. So, you know, thank you, and please continue the good work.
Thank you very much, Claire. I wonder, before I turn to Anton, I just want to connect up something Paul said with one of your comments. It's clear that there is this enormous appetite for economics research. Treasury is a big consumer and also a producer. We've had the benefits of many conversations with your colleagues about the research they're doing. But I'm kind of wondering about academics dotted around the country who've got an idea that they think the Treasury may be interested in, and they're going to need some, you know, proof that the Treasury is interested in order to get funding from Paul. How do they go about that? Do they just send an email in to Rishi? How does it work for someone sitting in let me use a random economics department, Glasgow, for example, and they suddenly say to themselves, I've got this great idea to do this work on the impact of COVID on the retail sector north of the border, and I know the Treasury would be interested because it's thinking about the Barnett formula for some reason at the moment. I can't think why, and I'd like to share it with the Treasury. How do they make content? Who should they be speaking to? Do we have a way in if we're outside of that very easy connection that we have, for example, at NISA and other research institutes dotted around?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and there's multiple ways in, right? So, we are always open to and really, really keen to receive information. You can send it to us directly, like I say, we are, forever researchers and analysts in the Treasury are looking at all sorts of different fora. I mean, we do obviously use people like the RES to help us access the latest thinking from academics. Things like the Economics Observatory is another really good platform that joins together academia and policy making. So platforms like that are incredibly helpful, I would say, because there's a huge amount out there, and it's important to try and think what's the best sort of route in. But I would say you've got a number of options here. One, you can send it us directly, and we will take a look. We read everything that comes into us directly, or like I say, through platforms that do quite a lot of sorting. I would say places like NISA, like the RES, like the Economics Observatory are actually very good at understanding what it is that policymakers need and how they can dock into those systems, because you've got people there with a lot of experience. And so I would say actually in a way you want to think about both, but you will find, talk to someone doing really good research and analysis, using really good data, thinking about really applied questions, will be part of a community and will be talking to other academic colleagues doing similar work, I'm sure, because they'll be wanting to test their ideas. And actually through those networks and communities, I think you'll find other colleagues who have good ideas to help it improve and pick it up. And like I say, we are monitoring and thinking about and looking at all of this analysis and research all the time. So anything which sort of promotes that work more broadly in the kind of economic discussion will be picked up and looked at by us. But like I say, if nothing else, feel free to send it in to us. We'll take a look.
Thank you, Claire, very much. That's great. We'll move on, if I may, to Anton Muscatelli, who maybe can bring this question back to how universities are thinking about their funding needs at this moment, particularly in economics departments, but obviously more broadly in social sciences. Anton.
Thanks, Jagjit. And again, it's a real pleasure and honor to be here with such distinguished colleagues. Jagjit, I think I'm going to make 4 points, basically. I think, first of all, I just want you to get the broader context, because I think it is important. Economics departments are part of wider universities. And I think the one thing that's important to understand, certainly for the UK, but also for many other Anglophone countries, is that actually the economics of research is actually quite complicated. Essentially, there's a cross-subsidy, and it's quite a substantial cross-subsidy in the UK that goes from non-publicly funded teaching, from fee income, particularly from postgraduate taught courses and international students, towards funding research. And this cross-subsidy of research is more marked, as you would expect, in very expensive subjects like STEM subjects, biomedicine. There's a big cross-subsidy going to these, as you mentioned at the start. But actually, it's also present in subjects like economics and many humanities and social sciences disciplines. That cross-subsidy in the case of economics departments, I think, is very much around internal funding for research. And of course, in some of the wealthier US universities, often that's been provided by substantial endowment income, but in the UK, it comes from fee income. And as I say, it's been very significant in disciplines like economics, partly because the base has grown rapidly over the last 10 years, as student numbers have grown on economics and business school type courses. This has grown our staff, and what essentially that internal funding does by buying time from teaching assistants, postgraduate postdocs, and PhD students, is to buy time for these economics researchers to do their research. But even when these resources are found externally by bidding to the likes of the ESRC or other funders, like the European Research Council or charities like Leverhulme, there is still a funding gap there. There is still a funding. I think that's a really important point to make at the outset. As Vice Chancellors, presidents of UK universities, we've often argued that we need to address this issue as a country around the sustainability of research. And last year you mentioned the issue of COVID and how it might impact on us. And actually, there was a moment of real fear when we had to have some pretty serious discussions with BEIS and Treasury around this, because the risk was that this funding, from international students because of reduced mobility could impact on research. And the issue has not gone away for as long as COVID continues to cast a shadow there. I should say, actually, I was part of a working group back in 2004 that with elements of what was then Research Council's UK to look at the whole full economic costing methodology. And I think we haven't really resolved the issue still in UK research since then. Now, it's not an easy issue to resolve, because if I were sitting on the other side of the table in government and say, well, how can you prove to me that your costing is value for money? So there's a real tension there, but I do think there needs to be a real debate around how UK research is funding. So we may want to come back to that. My second point is that economics, as in other social sciences, there's been quite a shift in the pattern of external research funding. And Paul mentioned some of this. I'm going to try and reinforce it. If you go back about 10 or more years, Carol and I were actually at the same time on the Research Grants Board of the ESRC. And I think economics research had a very different kind of pattern then. A lot of the grants were monodisciplinary, or if they were multidisciplinary, they tend to be in a very narrow way multidisciplinary, touching on some other social sciences. Now, of course, these were response mode grants, so they were only an element of what the ESRC funded, but nevertheless, they were more monodisciplinary. And arguably, I think the shape, the pattern of funding for research funded by the ESRC has changed over time. And I'm going to try and share with you, just to show you something about how, where economics sits in terms of ESRC funding. So this figure is, which hopefully you can see now, is essentially for the last 6 full financial years, so running from 2013 to 2019, 2,060 successful ESRC research grants and fellowships. And you can see where economics sits as a discipline if you rank these by primary subject alone. And economics sits around third. Paul said it's a substantial amount of funding that goes to economics. Now, actually, economics was top if you did it by year in 3 of the last 6 years. But overall, it falls just below sociology and development studies, and it received in total just over 100 million over this period. Excuse me for a second, let me just go and move this forward. However, if you look at it in a different way, if you look at not only the value of awards by primary discipline, but actually also include non-primary or secondary disciplines, actually economics ranks pretty highly in that. And it shows that actually economics is becoming more interdisciplinary. It is becoming more part of total ESRC funding. And that's even if we're just looking at a kind of basic ESRC type funding. And that's a good thing. And I'll come back to this later. The third point I wanted to make is that actually there's some really interesting patterns in funding if you look across Europe as well. And of course, the European Research Council has formed a really important part of not only economics funding, but also humanities and social sciences in recent years, because it is so substantial. But actually the pattern of that in economics is a bit different from other disciplines. And I looked at ERC grants, not at Horizon 2020 as a whole, just at ERC grants. And actually, if you look at that, actually it's very concentrated over time. These are all the ERC grants over the period of Horizon 2020, and is looking at the country of destination. And this is adding all the 3 categories, so starter grants, consolidator awards, and advanced grants. And as you see, the UK absolutely dominates this pattern. And it doesn't look any different if you split it by the 3 categories. Germany and Switzerland do a bit better if you look at only starter grants, but actually it is very concentrated. And actually, even within the UK, it's highly concentrated, even within that big UK bar. I'll stop sharing so you can hopefully see me. So I think this is an interesting question. How concentrated is economics funding becoming? And now to my final point, Jagjit, which is a bit about looking to the future and touching also on some of the issues that Paul and Claire mentioned, because the UK government has, of course, promised a huge uplift in our public R&D spending in the next few years. Now, I expect some of that funding will not simply be delivered through the baseline of the research councils like ESRC. It'd be very surprising if there was a huge uplift in that alone. Some of that will be packaged around particular initiative, particularly important issues that the government will want to drive through public R&D spend, and indeed many other departments other than BEIS. And indeed, we've seen this pattern even in the recent past. Even if you look at the period after 2016, and if you look at the 2020-21 corporate plan of the UKRI, 4.1 billion in 2020-21 by UKRI was spent on UKRI on Research Council spend, so avoiding taking to one part Research England, of which 162 million, as Paul mentioned, it's a small proportion of that was actually spent in the SRC. But actually, there were many more important tranches of investment. If you look at the National Productivity Investment Fund, it was about 1.3 billion was spent by UKRI during that year. So, it's over a third just under a third rather of the total spend on the basic research and innovation funding. And of course, some of that through the Strategic Priorities Fund went to the Productivity Institute, which NISA is involved in, and a number of other universities. It's based in Manchester University, but also involves my own university. So I think if future R&D spend by government will be packaged in similar ways on particular priorities, it is absolutely crucial, as Paul and Claire mentioned, that economics gets itself involved in these. And it's about shaping some of these programs. If I look at other disciplines, if I look at Paul mentioned the chemists, but if I look at the physicists, if I look at some of the other disciplines, they're very good within EPSRC and other research councils at getting together and trying to shape calls, trying to shape these programs. I mean, it's great to hear actually the work that Claire was mentioning has been done with RES around the COVID pandemic and around new directions for economics research. But I think more of this has to happen, because otherwise I think economics may lose out. And finally, if I look at my own university, increasingly, the good news is that increasingly other departments are hiring economists. I look at my Institute for Biodiversity and Animal Health. I look at my Institute of Health and Wellbeing. I look at many other areas. They're hiring economists. So economists are having influence, but not just through economics departments. So let me stop there. But my central message is this: I think for the health of the discipline, economics has to become even more porous with respect to other social sciences, but also beyond the social sciences. It needs to influence the funding landscape. And I think there's a natural tension here between the growing size of the academic base in economics and the availability of monodisciplinary research funding. And that's not going to go away, that tension. Thanks, Jagger.
Thank you very much, Anton. A comprehensive review of the landscape from the university perspective. Just wondered, before I turn to Agnes for a point of view from France, I just wonder if I take your central message, Anton, that we need to shape research programs, get involved with the UKRI and sort of make the point and make sure that research programs are congruent in a sense with economics research. And you compared it to the sciences where that's happened. What are the incentives for scientists that have meant that people at the top of the research profession have been prepared to spend time doing that are absent in economics, meaning there's a shortage of people doing that? What are the differences? Why don't we do that? And how could we change those incentives to make that happen, do you think, Anton?
Yeah, I think you're right, Jack. These are the incentives. And the basic incentive is that, of course, in science, unless you have external funding, because it involves such a large capital element, you're not going to be able to conduct research. So it's an absolute lifeblood. External funding is the lifeblood of research. And it hasn't been the same in economics. If I'm a distinguished economist sitting in an economics department, I'm not competing for external funding, thank goodness. I would miss out, I suspect. But if I don't get a grant, if I'm not unlucky, there are alternatives. And if my research is worthwhile because it produces great outputs, I'm sure my department or my school will keep supporting me in the short run. Because it's my time, essentially, a lot of it is time based or it's data based, and a lot of these things are relatively small. If I'm a quantum physicist, that's not the most expensive part of physics. I'm not going to be able to do much unless you're going to buy me quite a lot of kit. So I think that's a big issue, and I think we need to look at the incentives, and maybe it's something for the Royal Economic Society to think, because some of these, there's huge externalities here, of course. And this is why I think that particular market failure should be addressed probably by the likes of RES or institutions like NISR and the IFS in that space that can help to do the job for the wider community.
Thank you very much, Anton. Much food for thought there. If I may, I'd like to turn to Agnès Benassi to give us, if I may say, the French or European perspective. I'm not quite sure whether Britain is part of Europe anymore or not, but I'll leave it to the panel to tell me what the answer to that is. Agnès, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here. Very honored to have been invited. Actually, the UK, the UK is an island. It's not a boat, so it will stay there. So this is quite reassuring. So my job here is, as I understand it, to provide some perspective from the other side of the channel on the funding. So I will maybe share my screen to provide a few charts. So let me do it like that. Can you see it? Yeah. Okay. So the landscape of research funding in France is extremely different from what I know from the UK and what you are saying around the screen. Maybe two important features. The first one is that in France, the research funding is not so much reliant on grants. So here, it's on the left-hand side, it's a chart from the OECD, giving the proportion of the budgets that are related to grants and to projects, to specific projects. So the UK, unfortunately, is not on the chart, but we know it's quite high, whereas France, the laggard, is on the very, very low end of the chart. Second feature is that research in France doesn't pay. The wages of the researchers are extremely low. They are not competitive from an international point of view. Here I give the wages for the National Institute of Research, CNRS. For a junior, a researcher, it's about 2,000 to 2,600 euros per month in gross terms. So you have to deduct social contributions from that. And so we are talking about hiring young researchers after the PhD, of course, but also after sometimes several postdocs. And so the wages for senior researchers are higher, but not so high. And so I give the minimum wage and median wage as a comparison. So these wages obviously are higher, but not so high. So I will come back to that because this is really a concern. The second thing is that the funding coming from the European Union is not so large. Here on the left-hand side, you have a comparison for FP567 and also Horizon 2020. So it is a distribution of the funds across European countries. And so Germany is first, and then comes the UK and France only third. On the right-hand side, you have the ERC. So it's very close to what Anton just showed. So I think he had the total grants from ERC, whereas here it's only starting grants. So the bars corresponds to the number of projects. So it's the UK is very successful in getting a project from the ERC over the 2007 to 2020 period. It's the accumulated numbers. And I should also say that it's only for economics here. But the success rates, so France is much lower, but in terms of the success rates, it's about the same. It means that there is an incentive, there seems to be an incentive, an organization or whatever in the UK to apply for these grants, which is much higher than in France. And it's also the same for advanced grants. And I was part of the ERC panel last year, and what was really striking was that there seems to be a negative loop because the success rates are quite low, So scholars are discouraged. They prefer not to spend because it's quite costly to to apply. So since the success rate is low, they don't apply. And then at the end, the number of grants that are allocated to economics depends on the applications of the previous years. So the lower the number of applications, the lower the number of grants the next years, hence the lower the success rates, and so on and so forth. So there's kind of negative loop that is very detrimental to economics. Now, to give you some hope about the French research, a recent bill was adopted in December. So a bill was adopted in December 2020 to upgrade the system, and there are three pillars. The first one is to rely more on funding on a project basis. So an additional funding will be channeled through the National Research Agency that provides grants based on projects. The second thing is an increase in the wages for junior researchers, so from 1.4 to 2 times the minimum wage for starting remuneration, plus a grant for the research itself. And the third pillar is to improve the dissemination of the research to society. So all this is for all the research, not just economics. In the field of economics, here I give an example which I know, which is Paris School of Economics. And we'll have, so at PSC, there is quite a diversified funding. I should say from the start that PSC is a kind of joint venture with different institutions like University of Paris one, CNRS, INRA, etc., different research institutions, and they provide researchers that pay for their basic wage, and then these researchers can apply for additional funding, and this is what is shown here. So I would say most of the research, full-time researchers at PSC, actually they are paid outside of this budget. So as PSC itself is concerned, you see that the budget is quite diversified. Between the bottom is national projects, national investment in research. That is, so it's a grant that PSC applied, and it's multi-year, so it's quite stable. Then there are research grants like Horizon 2020. Then there are shares. So these are partnerships with some institutions like Paris Hospitals or the Banque de France. And then there is consultancy, and on the top some sponsors and so this is very different from the UK. Registration fees are extremely small. So the fees for students are extremely small in France. And the registration fees here is for special curricula like the summer school. I will maybe finish with the role of economic research in policymaking, because now I have crossed the Rubicon and I'm at the Treasury. So I'm very sympathetic with what Claire said. The Treasury is a consumer of economic research. And we receive all kinds of research, and we read that and we use that. A few years ago, I was at the Council of Economic Analysis, and we compared the role of academic research in policymaking in different European countries. And what we did was to go to REPEC and to take the top 100 researchers in each country, well, the biggest countries, and to screen their CVs and to figure out whether they were doing only research over their career. So the top 100 are quite senior people. So had they done only quote unquote only research, which is going to be used downstream by different institutes, or they have participated in advisory councils or expert groups, committees, and so on, written reports for public administration, European administration, or international ones. Or they have during their career been in the decision employed in decision-making bodies like Claire and myself. And so we have counted these people, and it happens that the UK and France are quite similar. So the direct participation, which is the third case here mentioned, is quite small. So there are few people, and especially when you compare with the US, this is quite well known in the UK. But quite a lot of scholars do participate in these advisory groups, write reports and so on in the UK and in France, compared to, for instance, Germany or Italy. I found this figure was quite interesting. And in France, I must say that has been an explosion of the research that is used in policymaking through the explosion of data availability and the evaluation of public policies that this has allowed. This is extremely used with great intensity in the policymaking, on top of the various councils. So I mentioned the Council of Economic Analysis, which is general, but there are specific councils, like for macroprudential policy, like for taxation, for pensions. And in each of these councils, there are academic people, and their role is extremely important to raise the level of understanding and to make the decisions really research-based. So there's kind of hope here with some improvement over years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnes. What a fascinating presentation. One's tempted to say "Vive la Défense," but in fact there are many things that are similar as well, I think, across the countries. I was really intrigued with the diagram showing that only 17% of US academics were only involved in research, and are spending on, seem to be, in a compositional sense, much more involved in outreach, either directly or indirectly. I wonder, I mean, we could guess at the reasons for that, but one also observes that there's a hell of a lot of high quality research coming out of the States. So it's not as though it's at the cost of very high quality research. So I wonder if you can give us any threads or ideas as to why that is, that they just seem to be more actively involved, either because of initial jobs or in the nature of their own genesis as economists. So do you have any clues to help us understand why our cousins across the pond are just much more likely to get involved in these advisory roles or policy roles?
Well, in the US, yes, it's much more common to go from university to public administration back and forth. So why is it so? When you look, for instance, at Germany, you can understand, because in Germany, there's many jobs in public administration are held by lawyers, actually. Economists have not so much importance in the public administration. When you look at France, there's a different explanation, which is the role of the École nationale d'administration. You see, these people that become high level civil servants. And these are not counted as economists, even though in some cases they happen to be trained in economics, but they are not in the tech. You see, they don't publish academic research, so they are not in our count as economists. And but in the UK, I would like to throw the ball back to you. Why is it so? Because the UK seems to be much more rational in this sense, where an economic position in the ministry will be filled by an economist, a professional economist, which seems to make sense. So why is the UK so close to France, whereas the structure of both the training and the research and the incentives, the funding of the universities, everything is so different?
A very good question. I'll pass that on for the moment. But before we, but that's a break. We'll come back to that, I think, because I want to open it up a little bit later on. I think it's almost a perfect entree into Carol's discussion about the profession in general and how it's worked. But before, Carol, just for a second, I wonder if I could just remind people there is the opportunity to put questions in through the chat. We have a few coming in, which we'll turn to after Carol. But I just want to remind people that there is the opportunity to do that. So please take a moment to send some questions through. If I may introduce Carol Proper once again, the President of the Royal Economic Society for this year. Carol, last but not least in terms of the panel.
Jajit, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. I'm partly talking with my RES hat on, but I'm really talking with my economics professor hat on, and as someone who has had large grants from the ERC, the ESRC, and various other government bodies over her life, and also is in an economics department. So I'm sort of talking really as that, and also as the ex-Vice Dean for Research in Imperial College, which is a very science-based university. So I think I'm going to echo many of the things that Paul started with, that Anton picked up, and that Claire also has said on this panel. So I want to start first by saying economics is an incredibly important profession. And the scope of economic inquiry has, over certainly my lifetime, and I think this was reflected in Angus's talk at lunchtime today, has become very broad. Economists are interested in all sorts of things, from macro models all the way across to human behavior and psychology. And it means that but at the same time, the economics perspective is quite distinctive. And I think that was illustrated in Matt's talk yesterday, when he was interested in social media and social media's impact. One of the things he was looking at that only economists really look at is social welfare. And that was one of the things he was trying to back out of his experiments. What is the consumer welfare of digital media? But what was also interesting about his talk was that he was also looking at his experiments, which is something, that's quite new to economics, at his experiments on happiness, life satisfaction, mood, interaction with family. So I think my point is that economics has gradually been moving into the territory of other social scientists, of psychologists, of sociologists, and that, I think, has implications. That's the first point I kind of want to make, and I'll come back to it. So I think and the second point, which echoes very much what Paul and Anton have been saying, is that in terms of funding for that research, the trend is towards big picture funding. Government and funders, whether they're government or whether they're Gates, want to solve, and philanthropy is a very important source of research funding, and increasingly so. They want to solve big picture problems. They don't want to calibrate the latest minor twiddle on a model. What they want to do is solve big picture problems like inequality, like health deficits, like trade, like migration, all really important issues, all of which economics can talk to. I think the problem is that in some of that, and that calls for interdisciplinary research or multidisciplinary research or research teams, which people have already talked about. I think the problem in some of that, and I know it as a health economist, where it's particularly been bad, I think, is that often economists are seen by non-economists, and this echoes something Paul said, like the accountants. So what you're asked to do is the cost-benefit analysis after all the research has been done on something super interesting, but that work itself is not academically rewarded. It's basically being a bean counter. So I think that's a kind of long-standing problem, that in some of these big collaborations, because people don't understand what economics offers, and indeed the kind of unique perspective of economics, in big collaborations, the economists are contacted late, and they're seen as basically accountants, or I think any economic accountant researcher would not even be seen this way. So I think that kind of poses those two things, that econ is really important and is moving into other people's social science territory, and the need for interdisciplinary research, say something about where you might think about going as a young economist. So I think, first of all, you are partly going to be part of a larger package. And that larger package is often going to be interdisciplinary. So you need to understand before you, and secondly, those grants are super competitive. I know this from when I worked as the Vice Dean at Imperial, that we would have 20 grants that we had to weed out of Imperial to put only one in front of a funder. So that's a big process, that kind of thing. And in order to make it successful, those disciplines have to have worked with each other, or rather the researchers have to have worked with each other long before they get to the grant application stage, because that's what makes a good grant. You know what you can do, what the limits are, what you can't do. So I think that as kind of my advice to a kind of younger person is, first, if you want to be part of those large grants, and I think economists should want to be part of them because of what we can uniquely contribute, you have to, as a younger researcher, build up those networks within your university. Build them up, because the people who are really interested in cross-disciplinary work and in new ideas are not the old, but are the people who are coming into a profession, who've got their PhDs, who've maybe done a postdoc and are excited about ideas. That's the time to begin to talk to people in other faculties, in other areas. So in, some of my colleagues who are interested in machine learning spend a lot of time talking to statisticians and to ops people and data scientists. Some of my colleagues who are interested in health spend a lot of time building up relationships with young medics. You don't want to build up relationships with old medics. They already know how to do it and they've got their networks. You want to build up relationships with people who are like where you are as assistant or associate profs. You probably need to try and get a grant in you. If you really want to go on this track, you probably need to get a small grant in your own right. And there the ESRC is a very good place to go for that, because you'll learn how to write grants. And then I think that will build an understanding early on in your career of what it means and what you have to do to be successful in this very competitive field. And I think in terms of kind of thinking about incentives, I think as universities move to having promotion systems which perhaps cross the social sciences and the sciences, it will be more important to be able to show that you've either been part of collaborative research or part of being able to get grants. It obviously isn't as vital. It's totally vital for some of the scientists to be involved in lab work and to get those grants to do anything. It isn't vital for economists, but I think it is something that will be seen as more important. Interestingly, it is seen as more important in the US. So I think I don't want to take up any more time, because I think there are lots of questions, but that's kind of my perspective as both. And finally, to say, as the RES, we have actually been trying to support early career researchers in our $500,000 COVID fund that we've had this year. So that's just a plug for the RES.
Thank you, Carol. Incredibly clear. I know Anton wants to potentially come back on Agnes's question in a second, but I just wonder, Carol, does all this pressure we're putting on early career researchers, you've done your PhD in a technical area of economics that might be quite narrow, then we're asking those people to publish in top journals within a few years if they want to be made permanent or gain tenure, or whatever the language is in their particular department. And at the same time, we're asking them to reach out across the university as well as do very high standard teaching. How can we provide, I mean, I know the RES has done a lot in the last year in terms of its COVID research support, but do we need to rethink what we're doing for early career researchers, make more funds available, allow them more time to develop their research careers? What are the implications? Because we need to bring people on in the early level and not make it absolutely impossible for them. It just seems really hard starting out right now.
I mean, I think one of the moves towards a 7-year or 6-year tenure track system does really help, especially with decent support for maternity, years off for maternity, and awards to come back from maternity or paternity breaks. And most universities, I think, are now kind of moving towards that. Not necessarily the 7 years, but being serious about giving people mat and pat leave and help when they get back. I wasn't suggesting in a sense that you leap into grant applications. I sort of think grant applications come very much towards the end of your assistant professorship time and at the beginning. And of course, success in the European Research Council for the starter grants really comes from people who've already done 5-6 years of their own research. So they have a track record in their own area. So I'm not saying that you want to start. I mean, there are some fields in which you do look for grants much earlier, health economics being one of them, because people often work in teams with medics, but who are much more reliant on grants. But I think I would not rush into grant. I mean, I can say that I got a grant to do my own PhD, but I wouldn't rush into it. I think it's something that comes once you've started publishing, as you're moving towards the associate professor role. And then after that, but also during that, you can build up friendships and interests with people in other disciplines. And if you're so inclined, I mean, clearly if you kind of just do micro theory and you want to do micro theory, that's fine, but you don't actually need that much funding for micro theory. A small grant in your own right is fine there. But if you do want to work on these big kind of interdisciplinary, super exciting problems, I mean, think about Rachel's going to talk tomorrow us about obesity and what economics can say about obesity. If you think of the kind of talks that have been here. So I think it's part of thinking about how you build a career. But I mean, it is tough, I think.
Just very minor follow-up. I wonder if the RES might be able to set some norms here, because if we're talking about 90-odd departments around the country, different departments or universities may adopt different sort of horizons and different pressures on staff. So if I've just joined a particular department in the country, and I won't say Glasgow this time, and my head of school says, you need to do all of this in the next 18 months, I could point to some best practice document the RES has produced, and I could say, well, actually, you've got to give me 7 years to do this, not 18 months. And that might help the right kind of support being delivered to the profession across the country, rather than, you just don't know at 25 or 26. This is what you need to do over the next 2 years. You say, well, I'm going to have to do it. That's my boss. But if there was more sorry. Oh, well, whatever. I just, chose.
I was going to say more like 30, but but also, I mean, I take your point, and I think there are, we are working on how to support. We have an education and training committee, and that is one of the things we need to sort about. I think it also needs to be recognised that actually there aren't that many freestanding economics departments anymore. A lot of them, economists, as Anton said, work in other areas or are in business schools. And I think there needs to be a think at university level about what the incentives are for young academics. I think that's very clear from France that, if you have low incentives to become a researcher, only very certain types of people, usually who have money from their family or spouses, can afford to become researchers.
Thank you, Carol. And Anton, I know you wanted to come in on the question Agnes posed as to why so few of us across this side of the pond are involved in advisory bodies or in policy directly, in terms of the people at the very top of the profession. Do you have some clues as to that might allow us to construct a reasonable answer to Agnes's question, which I wasn't able to do?
Well, I actually found Agnes's data really fascinating, so thank you, Agnes, for that. And I've been trying to think about the question since you posed it, but and I suspect it's both a supply and a demand problem, actually. But let me look at the incentive side from the academics' point of view, which is why we get involved. I do wonder whether actually in economics we do need to think about the way in which the work that we do for impact is valued. Now, of course, in the UK we've got these research evaluation exercises, which are very important and which are very different from what happens in the US, of course, where once you've obtained tenure, actually you have a relative degree of freedom in terms of how you divide your time and how. So part of the answer may be around that. I mean, I was with Nick Stern. I was with Nick Stern on his review of the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, and I know we spoke quite a bit in that group about whether we should loosen the impact, the difference between impact and the work that we do on impact in our publication track record. Because if I now slip into anecdote and tell you my own experience, some of the work I've done in terms of advising government has been around, has only a very loose connection with my actual research papers. The kind of things that I've been doing around, fiscal devolution, for instance. Well, I haven't published a huge amount in fiscal devolution. I've published a little bit. But this was an important. I was asked by the UK government to convene a technical working group for the Calman Commission around devolution in Scotland. Now, when I returned that to the Research Excellence Framework, I had to jump through real hoops trying to create links between that and my research because there wasn't a natural link. But I didn't care because by then I'd moved into the management side of universities. But if I'd been a kind of professor or an associate professor at that stage, I would have cared. It would have impacted on my incentives. So I do wonder whether we do need to look at the incentive structure that things like the Research Excellence Framework provide, not only for economists, but also for other social scientists who are likely to operate at the interface between their discipline and policy. Because, it certainly, I think, does impact on your choices to whether you produce more research outputs or you get involved in advisory type roles.
Thank you very much, Anton. I guess we all need principals of VCs like you encouraging us to get involved in public policy. But that's certainly another way of thinking about incentives, the internal and the external. Paul, we've had a few questions coming from the audience, and they're very much, I think, focused in a sense on the ESRC. We have one question which says, why is funding low when the demand is very high? And related question, which is when you're trying to get funded and you're looking at a particular funding application, what is more valued, the statement about social impacts or the likely academic contribution, which of course in a sense is going to be backward looking because you can't promise to hit a top journal with a research funding application. So I guess it's a question about how. So if I'm looking for funding, what might a funding plan place more value on, the likely impact or the likely research outputs? Can you help the people in the audience think about that problem?
Right. Okay. I'll have a go. So every panel is different, and I should highlight that I don't sit on the panels, and the information walls in the ESRC are excellent. So I am not someone who's can give you day-to-day experiences of this, but my impression is the panels and the calls are different. So responsive mode may be different from a strategic panel, which is looking for particular things. I think one thing to highlight is that academic quality and social impact in economics do not necessarily conflict, and often very, very high quality work will eventually have significant social impact. And panels recognize that even work that is seemingly very theoretical and methodological will have impact through the support it gives downstream to other research. I think the issue, these are related. So my kind of second answer to the first question is really one of the issues that we are looking for is if it's not high academic quality, forget about it. Just it's not going to go anywhere. You don't stand a chance. But competition for resources is so high that having social impact can be the tiebreaker. So I think the panels, particularly in economics, are going to, if it's not really high quality, it's not going to get anywhere. If it's a choice between two high quality proposals, and one's got significant impact, good letters of support, clear articulation that this is addressing a really important policy topic, it is more likely to be funded. But I think for everyone is the difficult thing is the academic contribution, and we are very strongly in support of high quality work. I want to see from the work we produce people getting Nobel Prizes in the future. That's my performance metric. UK economists say we're the second best in the world. That isn't good enough for me. Okay, I want really, really high quality academic work. The second question about why is the funding low when the demand is high? This is a very, very interesting question that keeps me awake at night. A kind of a simplistic kind of answer is regulatory capture, but there are I think kind of historical reasons for this. So Nate Rosenberg, who used to be on the economics faculty at Stanford, once told me that when he was at the OECD, when the division when the allocation between the various areas of research was decided in the UK, they went and had a look at what the National Science Foundation was doing. And at that particular point in time, the social sciences, broadly understood, weren't funded by the National Science Foundation. They were largely funded by the Ford Foundation. So hence they came back with a very misleading picture of what was happening in the US. So there is a recognition that the allocations that existed in the 1960s may not be fit for purpose in the 2020s and 2030s. And UKRI was explicitly set up to look at how that can be readjusted. Now, we know from the experiences, if we look at the division of funding between the various branches of the American military since the Second World War, the world can change and the allocations can stay very similar. So you can get lock-in. But this is a question, as editor of Research Policy, I would love to see some people in the audience do some research on to tell me why.
Thank you, Paul. I just want to sort of just bring Claire back in briefly, related to some of the questions we've got, but not directly to some of the questions we've seen. And there's a debate in the questions between what we might call basic research, which may not directly have an obvious policy relevance, and what we might think of as applied policy research, which is absolutely asking a current policy question. And I'm wondering, as a comprehensive user of research, are you able, with the resources you've got, but also the demands on them are enormous at Treasury and across government, able to use basic research, or do you need more linkages, more involvement with academics to work out how to translate that into policy, or have you got sufficiently, I'm sure you have, sufficiently smart people dotted around Great George Street who can take a paper in JET, Journal of Economic Theory, and translate that into something the Chancellor might use next time he's thinking about some deduction on investment taxes or something? I mean, have you got the capability to translate basic research into policy impact?
It's a really good question, and let me be honest. We don't have. So I think people sort of look at places like the Treasury. Here we go again. We look at places like the Treasury, and they think it's absolutely jam-packed full of economists doing really technical modelling work. That is actually not true. The vast majority of people in the Treasury are not sort of technical economists doing modelling. I've got maybe 100 or so people doing what you would consider kind of macro, sort of specifically macroeconomic research. It's quite rare that we are doing our own very complex sort of computational analysis. The Brexit work I talked about is one example of where we did do that, and in that work we did actually spend quite a lot of time with academics and around the UK and abroad, looking at some of the very specifics, the particular parameters we were interested in and the like. But that was quite unusual. We don't do a huge amount of that, and we don't really have we're quite hair shirt here at the Treasury. It's not many of us. We don't have a lot of resources to be spending a lot of time doing that, so we are quite reliant on a number of things. We're reliant on, here we go, sorry, my daughters. We're so hair shirt that we don't even have lighting very often. But we don't have, we are quite reliant on actually outsourcing bits of this. So in a sense, to Paul, to sort of help the preservation, if you like, of the basic research. That is not, it's not something that we really spend a huge amount of time. You know, I completely appreciate this point about you sort of need the basic work to be able to get the more applied, to keep the applied analysis up to date, and sort of to continue, you know, that is, if you like, maintaining your infrastructure. It's not something that we in the Treasuries investor, you know, have the sort of capacity to invest a lot of time in, nor should we. We're not the experts in that sort of thing. So from my point of view, actually, it's interesting on the impact agenda. I thought what Anton said was a very good example of, you know, the vast majority of people who are at the cutting edge in academia of directly sort of supporting government and helping government. I mean, frankly, they do it for a mix of reasons that are mostly, I suspect, about public service and very little about their own personal career and progression in that. You know, most of the people that help us, you know, and you sort of ask for it, they do it because they genuinely care about making policy better, rather than because it's going to help them with some future research grant. And, you know, we're incredibly grateful that people do that, and thank goodness that we have that sort of desire to do public work in that way. But we don't spend a huge amount of time doing it, and like I said, I think it's because you know, we're not well resourced, and we don't have the expertise. Our expertise is, we're thinking about this complicated policy area. What's the latest academic research in that space? What's the latest data? How are people thinking about it? I mean, another thing I would say, you know, the journal system is fantastic and really, really great, but quite often in policy terms, we don't have time to wait for something to be hugely peer reviewed, to have gone through multiple journals. You know, if I think about the analysis we were using through COVID, you know, actually we were much more interested in what's the latest thinking, what's that. Unfortunately, there just isn't the sort of time. Not to say we don't value that work and we read it sort of over time, but actually quite often policy making, it moves much faster, and it, you know, it's much more sort of speedy than that, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Claire, very much. So I think if somebody's interested in basic research and to get that funded, they have to reach out in quite a substantive way in order to get the kind of user group positive tick up when it goes to the ESRC. There's a little bit of legwork to be done. They can't just send it in and expect necessarily the ESRC to fund it. So I think there's some work they need to be thinking about there. And that's where senior colleagues, I guess, either in their institute or university, should be able to guide them as people they need to talk to sell the idea. Carol, if I may turn to you as a health economist, and Agnes, I've got a question for you after that, but we have a question in the chat from a health economist who's really asking about modelling and health work. I could read it out. I'm a health economist. It's been a very siloed, focused experience on health technology assessment in part. But this has been where research and private funding is focused. Health system research, resilience, and the relationship between health and wealth receive comparatively little focus. I'd argue that while much good research happened through COVID, the core modelling health work suffered from a lack of economics and legacy of underfunding. So who in the system, I think is what the question meant, is thinking about these issues to provide more resources to health economics as a lesson from the COVID crisis, I guess. And as a related point that other people have made, you know, we understand very well now the connection between a healthy economy an economy which is healthy in a way that perhaps we've missed before. So I don't know, is that something that, Carol, we need to be flagging up as a priority area for research for the ESRC?
I totally agree with the question that, first of all, you know, during COVID, you just threw money at vaccine research and you needed to, and it paid off. And also at more sort of traditional public health issues. But I do think the fact that COVID has been both a health epidemic and an huge economic shock is actually going to mean that as funders think about coming out of this, they're going to be thinking about that intersection. I don't think there's anywhere formal in the system thinking about these issues, but you know, it's clear that people like Claire have been thinking about exactly these issues since kind of, you know, for over a year. And it's also clear that funders are going to be thinking about this intersection of issues. So I don't think that, speaking to a health economist, that it's kind of gloomy. I think there are going to be issues like the role of, you know, the impact on the labour market, the impact on competition, the role of digital in the economy, and how that affects health are going to be super important things, because that's that's what's happened to the economy and internationally as well.
Okay. So I interpret from that there are some opportunities there to push
I think so. And I think, you know, just looking at the conference program gives you an idea of the kind of scope that there is for being interested in things that were not thought of as traditional economics things. And that includes a whole pile of health things.
Thank you, Carol. Well, we're coming with 5 minutes to go towards the end of this fascinating session. I've learned so much. I want to thank you all for being so honest and open with your thoughts. But I do need to give everyone a final minute each, I think, just to make their final remarks. So I'll go in a random order. First, I'll turn to Agnes, if I may. There was a question about interdisciplinarity, which you may or may not want to pick up, whether it is also a bon mot in France as well. It's certainly something I hear all the time on this side of La Manche, whether it's something that's equally important in France. But then I will then turn to each of the panelists for a final remark as well, probably in the order of Paul, Claire, Anton, and then the president, if I may, Carol. Agnes.
Yes, thanks for asking the question. There's also a lot of interest in the interdisciplinary research in France. However, I see a few difficulties there. One is that when people talk about interdisciplinary research, they think within the social sciences. So it's like economics with some other social sciences. Whereas in my view, it should be, well, any other discipline. It could be law. Fortunately, there is research in economics and law, which is extremely interesting. But it could be also management, it could be math, it could be other areas. And some people try to, for instance, to develop some new thinking at the interface between economics and physics, and it's quite difficult actually to get it funded and accepted, and where to publish this sort of research is quite difficult in practice. The other aspect which is also difficult is the culture of each discipline. And my own experience in this area is quite, painful, because as economists, we have a very strong view about causality and the proof. And we are extremely proud of our methodologies and strict in terms of the proof. Whereas in other areas of social sciences, it's not always the same. It could be kind of picture descriptive, less than inference and proof. So the dialogue is not always so easy. So people think about interdisciplinary research as something extremely nice, where everybody would be complement and we would get the big picture. So hopefully, yes. But I would not say that it's so easy, both in terms of funding, in terms of recognition, but also in the making.
Thank you. Thank you, Agnes, very much. A different language, perhaps, in different disciplines as well, if I may say so. Thank you, Agnes. Claire, we have about a few seconds each, so it's a sort of parting sentence or two, if I may, but thank you very much for joining us.
Sure. Fine. Well, look, very briefly then, I would like to say, thank you. We love research. We're big consumers of it. Want to get as much of it as we can. But the best way to help us, frankly, is make it accessible, because we have less resource than you might expect, and we've got shorter time horizons than we would ideally have. So anything you can do that makes it as accessible as possible would be very much appreciated, but would really help us consume. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Paul. 15 seconds, Paul. Come on.
So following up that, please send your research directly to civil servants. They cannot access research behind a paywall. So there's a really serious problem there. It's that you do all this brilliant research, they won't be able to read it. So it's really important you engage with them. I think the kind of message from ESRC is strong support for economics. We are very proud of the economic research that we do support, and we would love to be supporting more. And I think the point about this kind of unique economics kind of focus on causality and data is a very, very useful skill that is widely applicable in many, many areas and is a huge addition to interdisciplinary research. For young people thinking about doing interdisciplinary research, I speak as someone who trained as a mathematician and a chemist and has ended up as a social scientist. I think you need to think carefully about that. I think you need to think very carefully about the sort of career you will have. I can't advise people to jump into it.
Thank you, Paul. Sagacious, I think there, Paul. Thank you. Anton.
Very quickly, Jagjit, I would like to pick up on what Claire said. I actually think we should look at incentives and research and how we evaluate research. I think we need to look at public service and public policy as part of that and make that, integrate that. I also want to pick up on something that Carol said. We need to look at the research culture in universities. There's something we've tried to bring in collegiality as a factor in promotions, which is about trying to create a more collaborative environment within departments like economics.
Thank you, Anton. Claire. Sorry, Carol, forgive me.
Sorry, I want to end actually not as something that the RES has supported. And if you want to do what Claire says, which is get your research noticed by policymakers, please offer to write something for the Economics Observatory. It's been a great thing to come out of COVID. All you have to do is write a couple of pages with an overview of an area you know all about. And the observatory has been fantastically supported by the ESRC. So a plug for contact the observatory and write for it.
Well, thank you, Carol. As one of the lead editors on Macro, I would agree with that as well. So send me your stuff. I'd love to read it. What a wonderful panel. Agnes, Claire, Paul, Carol, Anton, thank you so much. Let me, if there's time, thank Georgina at the Royal Economic Society for helping us, William today, but also my colleagues at NISA for helping us put this together. We've learned a hell of a lot, and I should also thank Ricardo Rice, whose idea this was to have this panel. He did a great job in bringing us all together. I hope that many of you who've been on the call today will think hard about how to get research funding, think about the accessibility of your research and have the confidence to talk to policymakers and ensure your work has traction. I've always felt economics is a policy-based science. If we don't affect policy, I ask myself, why am I doing it? So I think that's, I would like to say, and I hope many other people feel the same as well. Thank you again for joining us today. I think for those who are still on the call, you're able to say or pass some comments on it on some part of the screen. If you're part of the audience, do so there. I think the RAS are collecting feedback in some way or other. But you know, I've really learned a lot today, and thank you for your honesty, I think, and your openness about the issues we all face. Thank you. Goodbye.